So this is a tutorial on importing assets into Unreal 4. I'm going to go over setting up these, setting up custom collision mesh, and also auto-generating collision meshes in Unreal, watching out for the different types of setting and control, and then giving a few just general tips on getting assets into Unreal in an efficient pipeline. So there's quite a few things to know. So I'll just go ahead and jump right into it. So I'm going to give a couple of different examples because the process is more different between Maya and Max than it would be in a lot of other processes. So just to give you an idea of what we're working with, I'm going to be setting up a wall mesh and a floor mesh. And actually, I'm going to revert that back to the state that it was in previously so that it will be easier to understand. Okay, the first thing that we want to make sure that we do, and this is the case in almost any game engine process, you want to make sure that you have deleted history and set up assets for proper export. So I usually modify and freeze transformations and edit delete all by type history. And in this case, the asset is very simple, so I'm just going to export this one asset, but I have a material set up that's called m_wall, and it has my color, my diffuse texture, and my normal map already connected to it. Now, this will speed up the process of getting these assets imported, so it's a good idea to set these up like this in your project. The same thing is set up for this asset, with the exception that I actually have a collision mesh, and I also have an LOD mesh. So we're going to go through the process of setting all of these up. So the first thing that I want to jump into is I actually want to start a new project in Unreal. And I want to make sure that this is a project that's clean and straightforward, so that you can start importing your own content into this if you're using Unreal Engine. I'm going to use a first-person template because I want to have an easy time jumping in and playing in the scene. I'm not going to include starter content because this is about creating custom content, and we don't need to start with the stuff that Unreal Engine includes. And then I'm just going to name the project. So make sure you name it something descriptive. So in this case, I'm going to call mine import tutorial. And it looks like that already exists. I actually already made an import tutorial. So I'm just going to call it import tutorial 2. And then I'm going to go ahead and create the project. I already had it open. So while it's doing that, I'm actually going to jump into an example mesh in 3ds Max. And I'm going to go through just a very simple process of showing you how you export. Oh, looks like we didn't even need that time. But okay, so I'm going to jump into 3ds Max real quick. And I'm going to show like an example asset so that it's clear what it is that we're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and actually, I have a series of meshes here for setting up a collision geometry and 3 levels of LOD for my sphere, which is just, this is not necessarily how you would set up an asset. I just want to make sure that it's really obvious how this is working. So I made the collision geometry a little bit more extreme because I wanted it to be clear that we were creating the collision geometry. So there's a few things to watch out for when you're working with collisions and LODs in Unreal. So one of them is that you want to have the collision geometry that you're importing matching the name of the base level of LOD. So in this case, my base level of LOD is called sphere with a capital S. So the collision is actually UCX_sphere. And that's going to be really important because a lot of times if your collisions don't come in correctly, it'll be because of the asset not being named correctly. And just to make sure that you understand, it's not necessary that you make each of your LODs have any specific names, because what you'll do in both Maya and Max is set up LOD groups in their own system. So before we move on too far, I'm going to grab everything here. I'm going to go to the Utilities button, and I'm going to select Reset Xform, and I'm going to go to Reset Selected. Now this just makes sure that every object is clean. Then I'm going to go down and I'm going to collapse that to eliminate the Reset Xform. And then I also want to make sure that all of my LOD objects are directly on top of each other. So in Max, you have this little button here for typing in values. If you just right-click on the arrows, it'll just pop it to 0, 0, 0, and then you can have them all overlapping each other very easily. Another reason that it's very good to set up your assets at 0, 0, 0 is that just makes it a lot more straightforward. Now, so this says UCX sphere here, so this is going to work as a collision. But in a lot of cases, you're going to end up making objects that have multiple collision meshes on them. So I'm actually just going to do that really quickly, just for illustration purposes. I'm going to make one other collision mesh. And this is, again, not how I would set up an asset, but I want to show you how this works. So this one, I'm going to go ahead and collapse it. And then I'm going to call this UCX sphere as well. Now, there's one thing that's worth noting, is that in Unreal Engine, there's a naming convention for setting up collisions. And you can find this at their documentation. That's the FBX static mesh pipeline. And the way that it works is if you're using a simple box primitive, you can just call it a UBX underscore, and then it's the render mesh name in Pascal case, so no additional underscores or anything like that. USP is the sphere, or UCX is the most common one, which is a convex mesh. And that's one that you would create and you'd make edits to. So the main distinction is that, like, a sphere can only be an unedited sphere. A box can only be an unedited box. And UCX can be any shape as long as it is convex and not concave. So they have an illustrative image here, which is that anything that has faces that intersect or go inside themselves. So if you were to continue the line of each side of the face infinitely into the distance, anything that has concave surfaces, that line will end up intersecting another part of the object. Whereas something that has all convex surfaces, none of the lines of any of the sides will ever end up intersecting any of the other sides. And this is really important because it will not work correctly otherwise. They will be modified so that they are convex, and in some cases you might not even be able to get the mesh to work correctly. So so be aware of that. But yeah, so I just wanted to give this as an illustration. I'm going to hold Alt and X to make these transparent. But yeah, so each of these collision meshes will be applied to the asset. And then, but before we can actually get this object to work, we need to grab our sphere LOD, and our sphere LOD2. Select all of them together. So I just opened up the select by name hierarchy, selected those objects, hit OK. And then I'm going to go to group, and I'm going to call this sphere. So I just name it the same as the asset, the first asset. I don't think that will actually affect it, but you need to have a group in order to set up an LOD. So then you go to the utilities panel, and then under utilities you select more, and you can go to level of detail and hit OK. And then basically what you do is, just with that group selected, you create a new set. And then you'll see that hopefully all of the assets that you populated will be in there. Now, it's not necessary to make edits here because you can edit the content in the Unreal Engine itself. So I'm just going to actually leave this like that, and I'm actually going to make an export for this. So I'm selecting all of my objects, and then I go to export. I can go to export selected. I'm going to go to sphere LOD. I want to make sure I have smoothing groups, and convert deforming dummies to bones is fine, but I preserve edge orientation, and then I'll go ahead and hit OK. So then, okay, jumping into my scene, I'm actually going to go ahead and make a new folder. I'm going to call this folder let's see, we'll call it art. We'll call it that. And then I'll make sure that it's in my content folder, so I'm going to move it there. And then I'm going to create another folder inside there. I'm going to call that folder levels. Now, I don't want to work with the default scene here, so I'm going to go to new level, select default, and I'm actually going to delete this. Well, actually, I don't need to delete the floor too much. It's not necessary. So, and so then if I were to jump in and play, then it'll play with the first-person character, just in this basic scene. But then I want to save this scene, so I'm going to go to Save As. I'm going to save it into my Levels folder, and I'm going to call this scene My Level. And then that way you'll see that in the Levels folder there's actually a scene called My Level. Now, and that's a good idea to start saving your scene files in somewhere that's organized and discrete, because there will be some, especially if you're using starter content, there's a tendency for a lot of people who are new in Unreal to not really organize their stuff, and they'll just start like working in one of the default scenes or something like that. So it's a good idea to set that up, and then to save them all in the same location as far as levels. And you can even make subfolders and things like that. That's fine. But okay, so in my art folder, I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call this test sphere. And then I'm just going to browse into that folder, and I can go to import asset, or I can actually just find my asset and I can just drag it in. I'm going to turn off auto-generate collision because we created collision meshes. If you're just importing them normally, you can select auto-generate collision and that'll work fine. I'm actually not going to use auto-generate collision in anything in this lesson because I want to go through the process of actually making the collisions. But static mesh LOD group, you don't have to worry about that. So you can try using one convex hull per UCX, and that should be fine. Generate light map UVs is helpful if you don't have light map UVs that you built into your object. And you probably won't if this is your first time jumping in. I could do a whole separate lesson on setting up light map UVs for game content. But don't worry about that too much. You also want to go to import mesh LODs, and you want to check that. Now, combined meshes is interesting because actually you can export a bunch of different assets in a single FBX, and if you uncheck combined meshes, as long as you're adhering to proper naming conventions, you can have it automatically populate each individual asset as its own asset, and you can even use the UCX naming convention and the LOD system to break them up. So I don't have any reason to actually not combine the meshes, but it's very often useful to export a set of assets all from the same scene because it's a one-stop repository and it's a lot easier to work with. So I recommend doing that if you can, but there's no reason to do that in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and hit import. And then, so what you'll notice, first of all, is if I hover over here, um, you'll notice it gives information about triangle invert count. It says how many UV channels there are, and it says how many materials there are. It tells you what the size of the object is, and it tells you how many collision prims there are. Now, the collision prims thing is useful because if you have imported collision primitives incorrectly, they're actually going to list 0, and you're going to see kind of like a yellow icon, like a yellow highlight over it. So I'm going to double click that and jump in. And so you can see actually we have our collision here. And that actually looks like it's mostly okay. And we actually have the LOD groups here as well. Now the only thing that I notice here is that I don't actually have all of my collision shapes. So it looks like I have a sphere is missing. So let me see what we can do here. So there's a couple of different options. One is that I can try adding a numbering suffix, which is like a number for the holes, so it's 0, 1, and 0, 2. Let me see. Oops. Actually, I want to grab all of these assets. Okay, and if you want to re-import an asset, you can always go ahead and just hit re-import, and that'll go through that process. Now, I don't think actually naming the holes was necessary, so let me see if go ahead and delete this really quick and try it again with a different import setting. So it says 1 convex hull for UCX. Let's see if we uncheck that if we get that sphere. So no, it looks like it's not liking our sphere, no, and that could actually be because I didn't list it as a USP. But in any case, I'm not going to worry about that too much because it's just an example mesh, and it does say it's coming in with more collision primitives. So in the future, if you don't have to name the hulls, but you probably want to set up individual pieces like what I did there. So hopefully that isn't too much of an issue. But okay, so let's talk about making the assets go through different LODs. So if you've messed with Unreal at all, one thing that you'll notice is that Unreal tends to default to showing information about your mesh as LOD 0. And so now you can kind of see what the application of that is, because LOD 0 is actually the base mesh, with LOD 1 being the reduced mesh, and then LOD 2 being an even further reduced mesh. And you can do as many of these as you want. And then under the LOD settings, like LOD group is fine, LOD import, you can actually re-import individual assets, and you can import them separately. You can also actually right-click and you can select Import LOD, and you can re-import individual LODs, or you could import a new LOD. So you actually can make them separate files as well, but I think it's more useful to make them all contained within the same file. So one thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we have the right settings for this. So like if I zoom in and out, you'll notice that you'll see some subtle changing happen as the mesh swaps out. Now, in a lot of cases, auto compute LOD distances is fine, but if you don't want to do that, you can uncheck, and then each of the meshes has a default option for screen size that you can control. So LOD 0, you pretty much always want it to be at 1, but then you can say, like, maybe I think that it's like too noticeable that these assets are starting to drop in. So I can like try to half it, for example. So I could like make this one happen at 0.66667. And then I could make this one happen at like 0.08. And then you'll notice that it is further away before it starts making that change. And this is all based on screen size, like screen percentage, basically, of like what percentage of the screen size is being taken up by the object. So it's not based on distance explicitly, because actually basing it on distance would be a little bit less direct in terms of what you would actually be seeing on the screen. So, okay, so this is basically an example of how setting up LODs and collisions would work. So I'm going to go ahead and save that asset. I think that mostly is correct. So then I'm going to go ahead and in my art folder, I'm going to make a new folder called architecture. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to export my assets from my wall and my floor from Maya. So first of all, I'm just going to export my wall, and I want to make sure that I have smoothing groups turned on. Reference asset content is good too. So I'll go through and just export this here. I already had an export of this. But also one thing that actually, just to go back to that for a second, one thing you want to make sure you have is uncheck animation, because there's no reason to actually export animation if you don't have any animation. That'll make things a little bit cleaner. And then I'm going to jump into this other asset, and we want to talk about setting up the LOD groups in Maya, which is a similar process to in Max, except it's a slightly quicker steps. So I'm going to unhide my UCX collision, just so you get an idea of what we're looking at. So we have, this is the base mesh, and then we have, this is the LOD mesh, and then this is just the collision geometry. And I just used the same material. It really doesn't matter, because the collision geometry doesn't ever use a material. And that way you just don't run the risk of importing a material that you didn't intend to. But so when you're working with these assets, you want to go ahead and make sure that you've set up, deleted your history and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go to delete all by type history. And sometimes if you have assets like this, you might want to zero them out to all be like directly on top of each other. So what you can do is there's a drop down here at the top, kind of in the middle of the screen, and you can select absolute transform, and while you're there you can just type in values, and you can type in 0, 0, 0, and that will put everything directly in the center. And then once you've got that, you can go to modify freeze transformations with all of those objects selected, and that'll just make sure that you don't have any scale, rotation, or any of those values together. So my assets are 400 centimeters, which roughly comes out the way that it should in Unreal Engine. So before we finish this up, I've got to set up my LODs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the first floor mesh, and you want to select these in order in Maya. So you want to select them in the order that they're supposed to come, starting with the highest level of detail and then moving down. So I'm going to select both of those. And then I'm going to go to Edit, Level of Detail, Group. And then that creates an LOD group. So I'm actually just going to name this LOD group Floor, which is just the same as I did in 3ds Max. I have some modeling resources, but actually for now, I don't need those, so I'm just going to get rid of them. But okay, and so that I can grab the UCX floor and then my floor LOD group, and I can export selection, and I'm just going to export that there. Now, one thing that's kind of cool in Unreal is all I actually have to do is I have to import the assets, and because I had the textures linked and they're in this texture folder that is directly adjacent, they will come in automatically. So I'll go to floor, wall, grab those. I just want to make sure that import materials and import textures are both checked. Now for this one, the floor Unreal, I'm going to leave auto-generate collision off. Import that. And I'm actually going to do the same for the wall. So I'm not making any changes here, except I probably want to do one convex hull per UCX, which is fine. So, okay. So then my floor came in with its collision prims, and then I've got the LOD happening here. But you can tell it's happening way too close. So I'm going to go and I'm going to turn off auto compute. And I'm going to change this screen size from 0.5 to like 0.1. And then I'm going to see how that looks. Okay, so it's still pretty noticeable. So I'm actually going to try doing like actually 0.025. That's probably actually a little bit too far. So we'll then go 0.04. Yeah, and I mean, and the idea is that in general you want to set this up so that it is basically not visible. So 0.03. I think that's probably okay. So, and we could tweak these quite a bit to make sure that they're correct. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, actually, this asset is pretty near like ready already. But so I'm gonna go ahead and hit save. And now, this is a little unorganized, and unfortunately, this is kind of part of what happens. Like in Unreal, you can't actually import folders or anything like that, so you actually have to make the folder structure. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new folder. I'm going to call this textures. I'm going to make another new folder. Call this materials. And I'm going to select all of the materials, and I'm going to move here. So if you just drag them over, it'll give you the option to move here. And then I'm going to drag each of these, move here. And then I'm going to import, oh no, actually I moved those into the wrong folder. Let me put those in the texture. Okay, and then I'm actually going to import because I have ambient occlusion maps that didn't come in automatically. So to my knowledge, there's actually no way to preload ambient occlusion maps so that they get imported at the same time. But that may not be true. There may be some way to some map channel to set it up. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and drag my floor and wall occlusion here. Now, every asset, when you import it, once you have this connection made between the original source assets and the game engine, you can right-click and select re-import at any time. And if you make changes to the original asset that you imported, it will apply here as well. Now, that's something that's super important to keep an eye on. And then if you want to make sure that you're saving all of your content in Unreal, you can hit the Save All button here. And that'll go through and that'll save any changes. Anything that's not saved has an asterisk on it that shows it is not fully saved yet. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to quickly make sure that I've got collisions on this wall. So we already had the collisions on the floor. And actually I had this called Floor Unreal, so I'm going to go ahead and undo that. I'm going to rename it. So if you right-click, you can select Rename and change it to Floor. But yeah, so the floor mesh had collisions because we generated it, but the wall mesh doesn't. So I'm going to show you where you can make collisions in Unreal. There's this button called Collision. You can go and you can add in a sphere, a capsule, a box, 10 DOP collisions of various types, 18 DOP, and 26 DOP. And so each of these just means that they have more planes that they use to calculate a larger number of collision shapes. So, and then there's also another option for auto convex collision, which is the same as what you see down here. And this can be used for making more complex collision geometry. And basically the main idea is that you want it to have the fewest number of hull verts and the lowest accuracy while still being what you need, because you don't want to generate something that's one-to-one between your mesh in a lot of cases. But I'm going to go ahead in this case and I'm going to add a box collision, which actually just conforms to the shape, which is really good. And then I should be done. I can just go ahead and hit save, make sure that that's committed. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to start laying out some of these assets. So I'm going to remove this floor asset, and then I'm going to jump in and start placing my own assets. So one good thing to keep in mind about Unreal is that Unreal has snapping options. So there's a position snapping, rotation snapping, and scale snapping. I tend to like snapping on higher values if I can. And these usually snap to 1, 5, 10, 50, 100, 500. And these are all in centimeters. So in my case, 100 snaps pretty well together with my assets. So I'm going to drag in my floor. And there we go. And then in Unreal, if you hold the Alt key, you can drag out copies. So I can grab these and I can easily make more copies of them. And I can drag out a few of these. So I'm going to just go and quickly assemble a few of these here. And then I'm going to drag out a wall asset. And the good thing about Unreal is that when you have the snaps turned on, you can toggle them on and off by clicking these orange buttons. But when you have snaps turned on, it'll actually automatically apply the snaps to your objects after they get dragged out. So I'm going to just basically make a quick arrangement of a scene here. And then I'll kind of finalize my materials and all that kind of stuff. So let's see. And I'm actually going to I want to make these walls appear on the outside of the interior. So I'm actually going to yeah, that'll be fine. I just scaled it negatively on the x-axis, and then I'm going to go ahead and make a few copies here. And then I'm actually just going to make like a small hallway extending off of this so that I have something else to work with. And this is just kind of like showing how I would set up certain assets. So I'm going to hold down Alt to drag out a copy while I rotate. And then I'm going to drag one more out and hinge that. So now, by the way, I always put my pivots in a similar position to where I did here, which is basically that they're locked to one side. And the reason I do that is pretty self-evident, I think, because you can see as you're moving objects around, being able to rotate on kind of like a hinge like that is super valuable. Really makes it a lot faster to get your assets set up. Okay, so this just kind of gives us an initial starting point. But I want to add a couple of assets here. So I want to add like a light or two. So in that, you go to the modes tab, which actually on most people's will probably default to being like right around here or something, but it's fully dockable, so I just pull it out of the way. And I'm going to add like a light here. And you can reduce snapping when you're working on something like lights, for example. But I'm going to drag out a light, and then from the details panel, I can give it kind of like an orangey glow. I can maybe increase the intensity a little bit, make it like extra bright. And then I can increase the radius, the attenuation radius, to make it look like it's kind of wrapping around the corner a little bit. And then maybe I can drag out another one and put that one on the other corner. And obviously, if I were making more of a complete scene, I'd have like a brazier or something like that holding the light. But then, yeah, there's a couple more things that I want to do because there's a process of setting up reflection probes that we can use to make this look a little bit more credible. And then we can adjust some of the materials, and this will be kind of like a good starting point. So I'm going to type in the filter reflection probes. Now there's box reflection probes, which do work pretty well. But then we'll also, in Unreal, they really advocate that you use spherical projection probes, reflection probes. And they kind of recommend that you do probes at kind of like key points where the environment looks significantly different. And you can make, and reflection probes are sort of based on sizing. So you can adjust the influence radius, and reflection probes will influence everything that is within their radius, and there will be like kind of a fade or a blend between objects that have multiple reflection probe influences. So this one I'm just actually going to type in 450 for the influence radius. I'm going to do the same with this one because you don't want to have reflection probes taking up like a huge chunk of the environment or anything like that. So so I'm going to go ahead and then make one more kind of like towards the end of the hall. And then I'll just put one midway between. So so then in my world outliner, I'll see that I have these sphere projection probes. And that's, sorry, reflection probes. And that should be okay. I don't think that there should be too much trouble with that. But my lighting is looking really uninteresting here right now. So in Unreal, you want to manually bake lighting to get your scenes to look correct. And actually, if we were to jump in and play right now, we'd actually have a lighting needs to be rebuilt notice, which would let us know that our lighting is not correct right now. So we do actually have lighting in here because it shows the preview lighting, but that's not what the final scene is meant to look like. So I'm going to go through and quickly do a build of this. So when you click the drop-down arrow next to build, you can select build lighting only. You can select the lighting quality, and preview is fine, but you can go up in quality, and ultimately it has a really slow computation time in production, but that's what you would be doing before you're actually making a build for a game that is running. This also builds paths and LODs, and there's a lot of stuff that you can go through here. But so you can do, like, for example, you can update reflection captures. I'm actually just going to build lighting only for right now. And then you'll have to allow swarm agent access. This will just take a second. So it says it's building here. You'll see the project progress there. And so then, yeah, so then that's actually what the lighting looks like when it's been baked. And it incorporates all of the lights that you put into the scene, depending on the settings that you have for the lights. So for example, like this this lighting is set to, so like it's set to visible, and it has like all of the settings work fine. I think we have cast shadows turned on. It's set to stationary instead of movable. And stationary means, like for a light, that it will be allowed to bake. But it also allows dynamic shadows if it's stationary. So we can change it to static if we didn't want it to cast any dynamic shadows. And then we could change it to movable if we wanted the light to be fully dynamic and not be baked. But yeah, so then let's jump in, look around a little bit. Okay, so then that looks a lot neater, I think. It looks a little bit more credible. And we've got our reflection probes are subtly affecting our character as we go through the environment. But let's make a couple of tweaks to our materials so that we can get something a little bit more interesting happening. We can adjust some of the like reflective properties and all that kind of stuff. So, so I'm going to jump into my material for my wall. And so if I just double click the material, this is the Unreal's material editor. You may be familiar with this if you've used Unreal 3 or if you've used Unreal 4 in the past. But so we have it automatically connected the normal map and the base texture for the albedo. So we've got a lot of that stuff already there, which looks pretty decent. What we don't have is we don't have any controls for the metallic or roughness features. And we also don't have the ambient occlusion set up. So I'm actually going to double click on the floor as well. And so we'll jump in here and we can check out each of these. So I'm going to, if you right click and drag in the window, you can move it around. If you left click and drag, you can drag a box selection. If you left click and drag in on individual nodes, you can move them around. So yeah, so right and left click can handle a lot of things. And this is a really complicated infrastructure where you can do tons and tons of things with it. So I couldn't possibly get to everything that you can do here right now, but I did want to show you how you can drag in new textures and hook them up and make a couple of simple modifications. So I'm going to open my textures folder real quick. And in my floor, I'm going to go to the floor occlusion. And in my wall, I'm going to go to the wall occlusion. And I'm going to just drag. These textures have 5 channel options. One of them at the top is RGB, so it's basically the color information. Then red, green, and blue are exactly what they seem like. They're the red and green and blue channels. And then the last one is just the alpha channel for the texture. So I just want the RGB for this, so I'm going to pull that into the ambient occlusion. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Now this creates a subtle effect. It'll be kind of hard to see in this video, but what it does is it allows your surfaces to use your ambient occlusion map to create more credible shading on the surface of your objects, particularly in areas where it's not having any direct light shining on it. So now I want to make this look like it's a little bit shinier. And the way that I'm going to do that is by making a couple of, just making a value that I can tell tell it to change to make the object more or less rough. So on the floor, I'm going to go ahead and hold down 1 on the keyboard, and I'm going to click. And that gives me a value for controlling roughness. So I'm going to plug that in there. And with a roughness of 0, let's go ahead and save that and actually see what it looks like, so that you can get an idea of what it's doing. So a roughness of 0 actually ends up making something that looks like super, super shiny. Now, we probably want to make this a little bit shiny, but maybe not that shiny. So we can go in and we can change that value from 0 to like 0.15 or something like that. That'll look a little bit better. Now, you can also use texture maps to control this effect, but this is a good introduction to just how these things work. Then also you can do a few tweaks. So if I hit Control W, I can make a copy of that, and we can just add in another one for the metallic property. And so just to give you an idea, this object is not metallic at all because there's no metals here, so it would be set to 0. But just to show you what it looks like if we made this 1, you can get kind of an idea of like, yeah, so you notice that it looks more like it has a metallic finish now. And you can use maps to control that if some objects have like parts of them that are metallic and parts of them that aren't. But yeah, no, in most cases you usually just want to set it to be 0 for most dielectric or non-conductive surfaces. So that looks pretty good. I think that that's actually, we're in pretty decent shape. Now, in the other material in the wall, I'm actually just going to add a small feature here, just so that you can see some of the things you can do. I'm going to hold down M on the keyboard and click, and I'm going to get a multiply node. And just for reference, you can also find a multiply node by typing in multiply into the palette to filter the searches, or you can right-click and you can go to like math multiply. And so, but what I want to do is I want to actually combine this with a color, and then plug that into the base color. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down 3 on the keyboard to get a constant 3. And then I can click down here in the details pane, and I can pick a color. And I'm just going to make this so that it maybe has a little bit of like a bluish tint, I guess, just because that'll be noticeable. So I can plug that in, and then I can save the change. No, that is not exactly how I wanted it to look. I guess that's because I didn't commit the change, so I need to hit OK. Okay, so let me see. You can also type in the values. I don't know why mine wasn't cooperating more, but okay, so I go ahead and hit OK, and then so then there you see it has kind of like a bluish tint. Go ahead and hit save. And then that just shows you, like, I think that doesn't look super appealing right now with my scene, but just to give you an idea of some of the things that you can do when you're affecting the outcome. So yeah, I mean, I think that probably about covers it as far as getting assets into Unreal. When I did my example project in Unity, I actually took a few assets in and kind of made a combination scene using using a Unity directly from Maya, taking an entire scene from Maya and bringing it into Unity. Now, that's not really a good idea to do in Unreal because of how Unreal sets up pivots and how they affect scene optimization and instancing. So I'm not going to show you how to do something like that because it really wouldn't serve any purpose. You'd only be able to bring in a single combined mesh, and it wouldn't really save you much time. Um, so really, if you're working in Unreal, you're going to be focusing on assembling your levels in Unreal Engine 4, and then you'll be building the individual asset content like we did here, um, rather than trying to build a full scene there. And in general, that's a good workflow for any game engine, but Unreal kind of doesn't really as easily facilitate doing it an alternate way. Like if you were actually trying to use Maya as your level editor, it doesn't really work so well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save my level. And the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to package this for distribution. So if I want to share it, um, or if you're in my class and you want to package it and give it to me, you can go to File, Package Project, and select Zip Up Project. Now you can zip this anywhere you want. It defaults to zipping it into the project folder directory, but you could like zip it into your documents or downloads or something like that. And then it'll just go through zipping up project for Windows. And then when that's done, then you should just have a zip that you could upload onto the internet, or you could load onto Dropbox or something for sharing with others. So there's other things that you can do here that we're not really getting into, because there's, like using the blueprint system or actually making a build of the game. And we're not going to worry about that right now. I think that this is a good introduction as it stands. So yeah, I think that about covers it. So thanks for watching the tutorial. This should get you started with getting your asset content into Unreal 4.